Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
Welcome to Crosspoint.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition.
It's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Soft as the voice of an angel breathing a lesson unheard. Hope with a gentle persuasion whispers a comforting word. Wait till the darkness is over. Wait till the tempest is done. Hope for the sunshine tomorrow after the shower is gone. After the shower is gone. Whispering hope, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice. Whispering hope, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice. If in the dusk of the twilight dim be the region far, will not the deepening darkness brighten the glimmering star? Then when the night is upon us, why should the heart sink away? When the dark midnight is over, watch for the breaking of day. Watch for the breaking of day. Whispering hope, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice. Whispering hope, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice. An anchor so steadfast rends the dark veil for the soul. Whither the master has entered, robbing the grave of its gold. Come then, oh come glad fruition, come to my sad weary heart. Come, oh thou blessed hope of glory, never, oh never depart. Never, oh never depart. Whispering hope, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice, whispering hope, how welcome thy voice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice, making my heart in sorrow rejoice.
There are many ways we collaborate with each other to be the church we're called to be and to serve how we serve. And our contributing financially is one of the most important of those ways. If you want to help fund and sustain what we get to do together, go to crosspoint.org/contribute to see the many simple ways that you can do so. You can even text crosspointenc to 77977 to receive a link to get started now. Thank you for your partnership in the work we do together.
How many times have you heard someone say, if I had money, I would do things my way? But little they know that it's so hard to find one rich man in 10 with a satisfied mind. Money can't buy back your youth when you're old. A friend when you're lonely, or peace to your soul. The wealthiest person is a pauper at times, compared to the man with a satisfied mind. Satisfied mind. When my life is over and my time has run out, my friends and my loved ones, I will leave them no doubt. But one thing's for certain, when it comes comes my time, I'll leave this old world with a satisfied mind. I'll leave this old world with a satisfied mind.
Good morning, Crosspoint. Before we jump into the teaching today, I want to remind those of you who are local to the Raleigh-Durham area that next week we'll be holding an in-person service outside on our campus from 10 to 11 a.m. Sunday morning. Now, for those of you who aren't local or who prefer to participate online, we'll still be offering the same format of an online experience next Sunday at 10 a.m. that you can then watch on demand whenever you want as well. Or if you just want to do both and double up next week, there will be unique music and teachings for both the online and in-person experiences. But for those of you interested in the in-person gathering, here's just a quick few reminders. One, it's going to be outside, and we're requiring every age-appropriate person to wear a mask regardless of vaccination status. We'll have separate experiences for adults, middle school, elementary, and pre-K students. However, you do need to note that we won't be able to provide any children's programming or childcare for kids under the age of 2. But they're more than welcome to join with you in the adult gathering if you want. Now, for that adult gathering, you'll need to bring a camp chair for everyone sitting in your group, and we should have plenty of space for everybody to spread out outside. And then 2 last important notes. If you have kids to check in for any of our Kids Point programming, check-in will open at 9:30 a.m. And I highly encourage you to get there around that time. You'll need to park, unload camp chairs, then walk to the back of the building where all our Kids Point teams will be set up, check your kid or kids in, stop by the coffee and snack tables, and then walk back to the parking lot in the front of the building to get your seats for the 10 a.m. service. So, if you arrive on campus 5 or 10 minutes before 10, it's most likely you're going to miss a chunk of the service because it's just nearly impossible to get all that done in that time. So, if you have kids to check in, definitely plan on getting there close to 9:30 so everything has a much better chance of going smoothly. And then lastly, we'll be sending out an email later this week with all the details for the in-person gathering on campus, as well as posting it on social media. But if you're not subscribed to our e-news, this would be a great opportunity to do so that you don't miss any of the necessary information. And you can sign up easily for that in less than a minute at crosspoint.org/e-news. Now, let's shift gears for a bit. Steve kicked off a new series of teachings last week that we're calling True Fictions, where we're looking at some specific fictional stories that Jesus told called parables. Dr. Amy Jill Levine is a professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University, and she writes this about parables. She says, "Parables are meant to prompt us to see the world in a different way, to challenge and at times indict. We might be better off thinking less about what they mean and more about what they can do: remind, provoke, refine, and disturb." And so similarly, as we walk through these parables, we want to wrestle with what do they do in us together? Because frankly, that's what ends up making these fictional stories true, and how they change and transform our perspectives and actions. And today, we want to look at an interaction that Jesus has with a man and a parable he tells the crowd in response to that conversation. And I want to read through it so that we have the whole context and then go back and walk through it together. We find the story in Luke chapter 12, and it goes like this. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, there's a reflex that many of us can have in listening to a story like this that can make us recoil, because what we can hear and assume is that the expectation of God on each of us is to sell everything, empty out the savings account, the 401k, and just give it all away. But at the same time, some of us can find ourselves with a family or a mortgage or a car payment or a kid that needs braces and wants to play travel sports, and that kind of expectation to sell everything and give it all away, frankly, can just feel outright unwise and even unloving at times. And so I want to say up front that I don't think that's what Jesus is getting at here. Throughout the scriptures, Jesus doesn't seem to have an issue with people prospering. He does, though, have a very clear issue with people who prosper by manipulating or hurting others. But the consistent theme we see throughout Jesus' teachings is that there's a heart issue that he's constantly trying to wake us up to and shine light on. And for Jesus, stories seem to be the most effective way to try and do that. So the interaction starts with verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? Now, for context's sake, it wasn't a rabbi's job or responsibility to make decisions about the dividing up of an inheritance. At this time, Jewish laws already had very specific instructions in terms of how a father's land would get divided among his children. And so this person in the crowd comes demanding something of Jesus, and Jesus is like, Why do you think this is my decision? This isn't my role. This isn't my responsibility. And while we don't know all the details, what seems apparent is that there's some sort of fractured relationship with these brothers. And so one of them comes to Jesus trying to demand that Jesus use his authority to side with him and to tell the other brother what to do. But again, Jesus doesn't take the bait, but rather addresses the heart behind what's happening. Verse 15, and he said to them, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So Jesus turns to the crowd and he speaks to all of them gathered there, including the brothers, and says, Here's what you need to guard against. This thing that can creep up in all of our hearts. This excessive desire for wealth and possessions that is often craved for the sake of increased power and influence. You see, that's covetousness. It's not having things that's covetousness. It's not even having nice things. It's an excessive desire for wealth and possessions for the sake of power and influence over others. Jesus says that's what we need to look out for in our hearts, because the richness of one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And as much as all of us know that when we pause to think through it rationally, it's so easy for us to forget that emotionally. We can justify and convince ourselves of practically anything in terms of why we need whatever abundance or excess we have or whatever excess we're pursuing. And so at this point, Jesus turns to the crowd and he tells them a parable, which again, we have to remember, parables are meant to disturb and refine and provoke. Jesus wants people to wrestle with this. He wants it to challenge them. So the thing is, if it makes you and I squirm a bit as we listen to this story, then it's probably doing its job. Look at verse 16. And Jesus told them a parable saying, The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. Now, To you and I reading this in America in the 21st century, this doesn't necessarily strike us as odd or stick out in any sort of shocking way. But we have to remember that's not the context of the people Jesus was telling these stories to. Rather, 2,000 years ago, in the ancient Middle East, one lived their entire life in community. You lived with large groups of extended family and friends, all under the same roof. You shared meals together, raised kids together. You shared responsibilities for daily livelihood with one another. And so what stands out in this particular story is that the land of an already rich man produced even more abundantly than he needed. And Jesus says, he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. Now, what we have to understand is that these were the kinds of significant decisions that one would discuss with their community. They would discuss this with the people that they lived with and lived around to try to figure out how the abundance could best be used. But notice, he's not discussing this idea with anyone else. Jesus makes it clear in the story, the rich man thought to himself, what shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops. So in the context in which Jesus tells this parable, to illustrate the importance of guarding one's heart from covetousness, this man has apparently isolated himself from community. And at the same time, isolated himself from the needs of others beyond himself, the needs of those around him. And this was the very foreign and disturbing idea to Jesus' audience. Still, look at how he continues the story in verse 18. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. Again, notice all the continued use of personal pronouns there. I will do this. I will do that. I will store all my grain, my goods. There's no sense of community here. There's no sense of gratitude for what the land has produced. This is all about what this abundance does for him. And then to add to the arrogance of self-entitlement, notice the man doesn't even say, you know what, I think I'm going to need to add on to my current barns or simply build some additional ones. Instead, he says, I'll tear down all my existing barns and just build even bigger ones to store all my grain, all my goods. And then we have this in verse 19. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. Now, from a story crafting perspective, notice how the rich man now takes over the telling of his own story. It's no longer a narrator, or in this case, Jesus, telling a story of a rich man where we would expect the story to go something like, then the man said to himself, or then the man said to his own soul. Instead, it dramatically switches to the first person. And what we read is, I will say to my soul. And it's as if this rich man has now taken control and power over even telling the very story that exposes him. The character has taken over the story. That's how blind he is. And that's also how brilliant storytelling works. Still, the man says to himself, soul, you have more than enough goods for yourself for many years to come, so relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But understand, Jesus doesn't pull this quote out of thin air. Rather, he's quoting from ancient Jewish religious literature that his audience would have been very familiar with. And by doing so, what he's doing is he's referencing the context that original quote was found in. Look at this quote from the ancient Jewish text called the Talmud. It says, when the community is in trouble, let not a man say, I will go to my house and I will eat and drink and all will be well with me. But rather, a man should share in the distress of the community. You see, by putting these same words in the rich man's mouth, Jesus is making a clear statement to his audience. This is not how you live in community with one another. For the rich man in the story, he's only concerned about his own security, his own pleasure, his own power. But a continual theme we see throughout all the scriptures is that it's not that wealth is bad, but that instead wealth and abundance is a way to love others. It's a way to care for the community. But still, the thing is, we don't have to live that way, right? But if we don't, we're only pretending to live in community with others. We're only pretending to live in a way that's oriented around what Jesus says is most central to everything. And so again, if we find that rubbing us the wrong way, remember, the very design of this story is to rattle us, to make us uncomfortable, to make us examine our own hearts and contemplate how we actually want to live. This isn't just some children's Bible story that gets shared and passed around. It's supposed to serve as this revealing mirror to our inner world. But next, Jesus does something with this parable that he doesn't do with any other parable that we have recorded in the New Testament. Jesus switches back to narrating the story in third person and then introduces God as a character in the story. We don't find any other parables where God is used as a character in one of these stories, but this is what we read in verse 20. But God said to him, to the rich man, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Now, that's a humbling and a sobering statement, right? I mean, there's just no way around it. But there's a couple observations that I want to make, though. One is, I think it's possible that Jesus uses God as a character in the story to further illustrate that this man is completely cut off from any relationships in his life. He's completely isolated. He's obviously not listening to anyone but himself. He's not trying to seek wisdom from God or from anyone else about how to use this excess and abundance. And so God interrupts this man's assurances to himself to relax and eat and drink and be merry. And God calls him a fool. That this is no way to live. And the God character says there's a cost to living that way. But a second thing I want to remind us of is that this is a story. Right? It's a parable. Jesus is telling this story with the intention of having it have a rattling, dramatic effect on the listener. And so by essentially having God take this man's life, Jesus may very well be trying to make a dramatic point, but Jesus may very well not intend for someone to conclude, you and I, thousands of years later, if you live like this, God will actually kill you. I mean, this is why genre is always important, right? It's why context is important. And still, something else I found interesting in studying this past week on this passage is how this particular part of the story was translated for the first 500 to 600 years after it was originally told. There's a translation of the Bible called Young's Literal Translation from 1862 that basically doesn't care how the flow of a particular sentence sounds in English or factor in context, but instead just translates each original Greek word in the order it appears. So it makes it rather clunky and antiquated to just try and read through, but it's helpful for parsing out each original word. And so I want you to notice how Young's translation puts this line of the story. And God said to him, "Unthinking one, this night thy soul they shall require from thee. And what things thou didst prepare, to whom shall they be?" I probably butchered most of that in trying to speak some Shakespearean type of language, but you can see that can make it much more difficult to follow when we read in that translation. But what I want us to notice most is the part where it says, "This night they shall require from thee thy soul." And up until the 6th century or so, this is how the original Greek was typically translated. They shall require of you. We'd probably say it this way today. This night they are demanding your very life from you. Now, there's no sense in trying to get into all the different reasons why many Greek translators changed it in later years, but I do find that it creates a different nuance to the story when we read it as, "This night, they are demanding your very life." Your abundance and your excess of possessions that you're trying to hoard more and more of for yourself, those are the things that are demanding your very life. They're literally taking your life away from you. And so, if you find yourself struggling with the idea of how Jesus paints the God character in the story and thinking, wait a second, I mean, that doesn't sound anything like how Jesus seems to treat people, perhaps this long-standing traditional translation of the text makes more sense. That it's the excess we find ourselves hoarding that actually ends up taking our soul from us and cutting us off from others, not this revengeful God figure. But regardless, Jesus summarizes things with one last line that we read in verse 21. "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." And with that, Jesus finishes the parable, drops the mic, and just moves on. So let's be honest with ourselves, right? This story has some edge to it, right? It can make us gulp a bit. And the temptation we all have is to deflect and start thinking, man, I mean, that is so true. I really wish so-and-so could hear this story. They really need to pay attention to this one. Because when we do that, we don't have to pay attention to our own inner world. We don't have to wrestle with what ways we perhaps find ourselves being the rich man in the story, and we excuse ourselves out of it. But the point of the parable isn't for someone else, it's for each of us to wrestle with. But here's a key. Part of that is that we're supposed to wrestle with it in the context of community. We're supposed to wrestle with it with other people. Parables are meant to be talked about with others, reflected on together, where people with different contexts and backgrounds share their perspective and insight on the story, where we can listen and discuss and learn from one another, and then together try to discern how do we best love each other and our neighbors. Because if we only find ourselves like the man in the story, thinking to just ourselves, we can find plenty of reasons to justify any amount of excess and abundance. We do that all the time. And it's not because we're bad and greedy people. I mean, just think about it. Let's assume that you had 20 cases of bottled water in your garage, and it was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was no bottled water to be found at any store, and you had a neighbor who had a burst pipe, and they had no access to water anywhere in their house. I think most of us, once we become aware of our neighbor's reality, most of us would gladly share some cases of the bottled water we had in the garage. Again, we're not bad people. But for some reason, have you ever noticed that somehow starts to become a little bit different for us when it comes to actual money and determining what an excess of money looks like? Now, probably most of us have imagined at one point, what would I do if I won the lottery? I mean, like, what would I do if hundreds of millions of dollars suddenly fell into my lap? And that's fun to think about. And probably many of us, as we dream about that, because we're good and decent people, we think stuff like, well, wouldn't it be awesome if that happened? I could just give a chunk of money away to this person or to that person or to this nonprofit or to this charity. And the idea of that sounds so good and so life-giving, and it makes our heart race with excitement. But the interesting thing to wrestle with is, well, when does the amount of money that we have right now become excess and abundance? What's that line when it crosses over to that? And the thing is, I don't know. I mean, there's no rule for it. Even though many of us would love it if it was just a clear rule, because then it could be black and white, right? We wouldn't have to ask hard questions or pay attention to our inner world, because we'd either just follow the rule or we determine that the rule is stupid in our own mind and then just ignore it. But what Jesus keeps insisting in everything he teaches, even in this story, that this is a heart issue, and that outside of the context of community and other voices in our lives, it's very easy to deceive ourselves and isolate ourselves from the needs of others. This story is to serve as a warning. But the thing is, the others, that's really not even crystal clear either, right? Because who's included in the others? Who qualifies as my neighbor? Is it by blood? Is it by family? By preference? By the street you live on, the city you live in, the state, the country? Is it by humanity? Is it the entire world of creation? Who gets included in love thy neighbor as yourself? And again, there isn't a rule that defines that for us. But rather, I think it's something that we discern within the context of community and relationship with one another. Now, I recognize that what I've done in the last few minutes is basically offer you a lot of questions and not really any answers. But I think when we encounter a story like this, that's probably best. That's probably what we're supposed to do. So it only makes sense that as we wrap this up, that what I want to try to do is give you one last question to ask and to ponder that I think is particularly important for the cultural moment we all find ourselves in right now in 2021. Because it seems everywhere you turn today, there are people endlessly arguing and declaring and protesting about their rights. Have you noticed that? It's going on a lot right now. But in the course of that cultural conversation, we've lost sight of that historically, rights and responsibilities were always discussed in tandem with one another. They weren't separate ideas. For instance, if you go to Google, even right now, and you type in rights and, just the word rights and see what follows next, see what it gets paired with, what immediately pops up in the suggestions below is all sorts of topics around rights and responsibilities. Because historically, they've been paired together. But one of the things that's been happening lately is that people keep making everything about their own individual rights. And here's the thing, individual rights are important. I'm not suggesting that they're not. Please hear me on that. But here's what I also want to suggest. Whenever you find yourself arguing about your own rights or you hear others doing the same, affirm that. Go, yes, of course, your rights are important. My rights are important, of course. But then simply add one additional question to that. Okay, and so then what also are my responsibilities? Or you know what? Okay, can we talk about then what our responsibilities to the greater good is? Yes, we have rights, but what then also are our responsibilities to the greater good, to the community, to society? Because rights are not meant to be divorced from responsibilities. They're just not. Even consider the idea of civil rights. The very root of that idea is that personal rights are in relation to how we live together with one another in a society, in a civilization. It's where the idea comes from, civil rights. And so, for the context of today's story, when we find ourselves asking, don't I have the right to do what I want to with my own money and with my own wealth and my own abundance? The answer is, of course. Of course you do. But if we're going to see ourselves living in community with others, we also have to ask ourselves, well, in light of that abundance, what are my responsibilities to the greater good? And there's lots of ways that that question applies to us as individuals and as families and as a nation, and lots of discussion that should happen in community about that. But as we close, I just want to make sure and say thank you to all of you, wherever you live in the world, who consider yourself part of this Crosspoint community, because this is what we try to live out together, where we intentionally choose to live on less and leverage our generosity together to try to love our neighbors well. And by leveraging those resources together, Crosspoint, we're able to do so much more than any of us could just do on our own. And because we're in community with a wide variety of different people, we can be aware of so many more needs of people than we ever could be aware of just on our own. And by asking that question together, what are my responsibilities and what are our responsibilities to the greater good? And contributing to this community, we get to align ourselves with people of similar hearts. And it's what has allowed us to pay hundreds and hundreds of bills for people in just the past year to keep a roof over their head and food on the table. It's what allows us to have teams of people who walk with those going through immense grief and suffering and do everything we can to shoulder the burden with them. It's what allows us to provide mentoring and counseling to people going through difficult rough patches. It's what allows us to try to help people heal from toxic and shame-driven narratives of God that were handed to them and point them toward a healthy view of the Bible and a love-centric way of Jesus. It's what allows us to help with things like affordable housing in our communities, to train and equip people to live out and advocate for racial justice and LGBTQ justice, and provide safe people and safe context for closeted gay kids to share the truth of their inner world without fear of shame, for abuse victims to reach out for help, for people walking through the pain of divorce to have people to journey with them, for those trying to heal and strengthen their relationships to get support and encouragement, at what allows for the prisoner to be reached out to in our community so that they know that their worst moments of regret don't have to define their worth and value as human beings, for those who feel alone and overwhelmed to know that there are people that they can turn to. Crosspoint, this is what we do together. And it's why my family and I contribute a percentage of all that we make here, because I want to be a part of those things. It's the kind of story I want to live with my life. And it's why I'm so grateful for all of you who contribute here as well to make all of this possible. Because friends, that's the fruit. That's the evidence of what God is doing through us. It isn't how many people show up in a building or how many views this experience gets online. And yet when people, especially those with kind of a ministry background, ask me about our church, often what they want to know is, well, how many people show up? Or how many views do you get? Like, that's the metric of our effectiveness somehow. But friends, that's not fruit. Because ultimately, that doesn't take any responsibility for the greater good of loving our neighbors. Rather, the fruit is how we're able to love and serve actual people together. That's the fruit we produce together. And so when people ask me about us as Crosspoint, I tell them all the things I just mentioned about how we care and love for people together, because that best tells the story of who we are, what we do together, and what we believe God is like, and what it means to put God's heart on display for the world. That's what makes us us. And Crosspoint, I'm really grateful to be in this community with you. So friends, here's to continuing to wrestle with these stories from Jesus together. Here's to listening and learning from one another, and here's to letting these stories make us necessarily uncomfortable when our own comfort has blinded us to the needs of others. And here's to generously and creatively figuring out together how to live out the story that God invites all of us into as we seek to love our neighbors as ourselves. Have a great week, Crosspoint.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.